Okay, okay. We had a wonderful evening dinner last night, and our guest is Dr. Rachel Fleishman. As I came to know her first, a colleague in neonatology, albeit on the East Coast, and an excellent writer. Her skills in writing come from deep within, and she's very intentional. But she has a voice and a craft that I think enlightens a number of us. First, it was reading about her experiences in the neonatal ICU. I happened to be honored to join she and two additional authors in a paper that we published about narrative neonatology in the Journal of Perinatology. I think it was 2022, is that right? Somewhere a few years ago. Dr. Fleischman came to us from Philadelphia, which is where she grew up, but her college was at Columbia in New York, her medical school at Einstein in the Bronx, and then she and her husband decided to have an adventure, and they went all the way to Seattle, where she took her residency and neonatal fellowship at the University of Washington. Then, are we going to stay here? It's a little bit different. Where are we going to go? Definitely not back to New York City, but to Philadelphia to be near family. And she has continued to work there. She's an associate professor and runs a narrative program there. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And she'll tell us a little bit more about that. Dr. Fleischman, it's a wonder to have you.
Do you remember what W.C. Fields put on his tombstone?
I do not.
Better here than Philadelphia.
Oh, okay. I guess that's a challenge. Make it better here.
Hopefully, given the subject I'm about to talk about, I will make you love the city, or at least a small part of it. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Rachel Fleischman, and my instructions for today were to explore what doctors do inside and outside of medicine. Does that sound correct? So I tried to rise to the challenge. I looked back at some of the lectures from years past and thought carefully about how I could speak to an audience of my fellow physicians and medical students about writing in a way that's meaningful to you. So a little bit by way of introduction, which you've already heard, I consider my own writing to be at the intersection of who I am. So I'm a physician. As Dr. Carter just said, I graduated from medical school in New York City at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. My pediatrics training and neonatology fellowship were at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's. My husband, Scott, is a career educator. He began as a math teacher, teaching in Harlem in the Bronx when we were just out of college, and then he followed me cross-country, and now he trains teachers and administrators. I have one very docile and skittish 11-and-a-half-year-old arthritic 30-pound white dog, and I have two teenage boys who are both about to be 14 and 17 years old, and I am proud in the last few years to also call myself something of a writer. Now, when I finished my fellowship, I needed a job, and I'm not always a lover of internet memes, but this is one of my favorites of all time. And so when you're looking for a first job as a physician, particularly when you're leaving the environment that has nurtured you, and I was at Seattle Children's for 8 years. I worked for a few years as a pediatric hospitalist and urgent care attending there in the emergency department and NICU before I did my fellowship. So I knew my environment, I knew the people around me, and to go somewhere new, particularly 3,000 miles away, I didn't know exactly what I was looking for other than that I wanted to be in Philly because my parents were there and they offered to help with my kids. And I stumbled into an environment where I had lots of attendee or attendings to help mentor me in my early career. So my first job out of training was at Hahnemann University Hospital and St. Christopher's Hospital for Children. And just to paint a picture for you of the environment in which I first graduated into practice, my division chief and first boss was the inimitable Maria de Livoria Papadopoulos, For those of you who may not have heard of her, if you're not a pediatrician or a neonatologist, Maria, as she preferred to be called, not to be disrespectful, is considered one of the mothers of neonatology. Maria grew up in Greece at a time when very few women went to medical school, particularly in Greece. Shortly after World War II, she became a physician. She described her early clinical practice in interviews and transcripts I've read of her just documenting that time. She worked in a polio ward, and Greece had frequent power outages, and there were all these children who survived in iron lungs, and the electricity would go out, and she would take stock of the ward, and she would have to select which child or two she was going to handbag until the electricity came on, knowing that all the rest were going to die. And that transformed her when she and her husband emigrated to Toronto, and she began her, at the time it wasn't exactly a fellowship, but she pursued an interest in neonatology. She could not abide the fact that premature infants died because they could not breathe. Their lungs were immature, and she felt like human beings were just being discarded in an unending natural catastrophe. So she and her mentors invented one of the very first neonatal ventilators, and they began placing infants on breathing machines. People thought they were crazy. The pediatricians in Toronto told them that they were growing a vegetable garden of potentially disabled children and had no business saving lives, but she indeed changed the world. The other formidable story to explain a little bit about Maria to you and the division that she built in her late career. She was called at the time that John F. Kennedy's son, Patrick, was born, and she was in Toronto. It was unseemly, the idea of a sitting president's son being evacuated to a foreign nation, as Canada was, to save his life. And it was also unseemly that Maria, a young female immigrant physician, might be the one person in the world with the tools to save him. And she basically told them, as Patrick lay dying in a hyperbaric chamber at the illustrious Boston Children's, that she would not be taking the child who she was caring for on her breathing machine off of that machine to bring it to Boston. She used to tell us many decades later that no one life, even the life of a sitting president's son, was more valuable than another. And we all know that Patrick passed away, and Maria did not go to Boston. Also at Hahnemann at the time was a man named Harbhajan Chawla. Chawla, who you see pictured here, used to say in jest, "I was the first neonatology fellow at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia," long before fellowships were a thing. And when he finished that very first fellowship, he moved across Philly to Hahnemann, where he founded the newborn nursery and neonatal intensive care unit, and he kept a pace with times and interventions and dedicated his career to that unit, and he made that place special. When Maria, who moved from Toronto to the University of Pennsylvania and then left Penn to come to Hahnemann and St. Christopher's, came, she brought with her Dr. Enla Andai, who you see pictured here with her long gray hair, and Enla was Maria's fellow. She also was my most attendeeist attending. When I was just out of fellowship and it would be 2 a.m. and I would have a patient before me and I would begin to doubt myself, I would call Enla. And she never once made me feel like I was asking a stupid question. And she would tell me, "No, Rachel, you've done all of the things. Trust yourself, the baby is in good care, keep going." And I owe much mentorship to Enla. There were not only obviously senior faculty at Hahnemann and St. Christopher's at the time that I joined. I could showcase every member of the division as a spectacular clinician and human, but just to pick one further example, Dr. Yannick Weber has made her fortunes and success as a global health physician. She has become a master trainer for what is known as helping babies breathe. She has traveled initially to Haiti early in her career around the time of her fellowship, and then to the Gambia, Guyana, and Uganda to teach as a master trainer helping babies breathe. There are estimates that roughly 1 million children die who are born not in facilities each year because they simply do not take a first breath. And when you train the whoever the birth attendants are, given whatever their background is, to breathe for those infants, you can save countless lives. And so that mission was awarded a humanitarian award by the March of Dimes, and she sits on the Global Health Committee for the American Academy of Pediatrics. Several years ago, Dr. Weber gave a grand rounds, and the theme of that grand rounds was global is local. So I want to bring you a little bit with me to Philadelphia. So Philadelphia, and in particular St. Christopher's Hospital for Children and Hahnemann, serve primarily the impoverished sections of North Philly. St. Christopher's is here, and Hahnemann is down here. St. Christopher's has the designation of serving more Medicaid and uninsured children of any children's hospital in the nation. This is structural. Largely, geography plays a part, as you see that the residents around each hospital are indeed living impoverished, but also Medicaid contracts do as well. At the time that I came to Philadelphia, and this has evolved over the years, but is inconsistently the same, not all children's hospitals in Philadelphia accept patients with all different Medicaid products. It has created a tiered system of pediatric healthcare in Philadelphia, where hope is advertised to all, but attainable in different forms to many. My interest in serving urban communities began in college, when my university encouraged all of its undergraduate students to embrace community service in the Harlem neighborhoods outside its gates. And when I moved north to the Bronx for medical school, the mission was embedded to my medical education as well. Hahnemann and St. Christopher's prided themselves on the mission-driven work of serving the patients, families, children of North Philadelphia. And the NICU in particular, for those who may not know, is a catch-all for myriad social problems, in part because those social problems, structural racism, poverty, air pollution, preeclampsia and diabetes, which are associated with social disadvantage, all weigh on pregnant bodies and impact fetal and neonatal health. There were times when working in the NICU and coming abreast of multiple social problems that are difficult to avoid in myriad languages, that it was difficult to see the difference between healthcare and social inequity that we face. This remains true in my current position at Jefferson Einstein Hospital, which is just here where the mouse is on the screen. Years before I was recruited to St. Christopher's and Hahnemann, the hospitals were embroiled in a bankruptcy by Allegheny Healthcare, and they were sold to a for-profit company. In 2018, while I was working there, the hospitals were sold then to a private equity company. In 2019, constant rumors about hospital financials and revolving leadership changes filled the hallways, back conference rooms gossip, and those who seriously believed the hospitals were imperiled again left for other jobs. Those of us who were more optimistic remained, and I was in a particularly unique position because in 2019 I had just returned. I'd left my job there in 2018, seeking a different type of work structure for my family. The academic demands of a fully well-rounded and balanced neonatology academic career were tricky for my young kids and my husband at the time, and I felt the pull elsewhere in the city, but I chose to return to my faculty position there because I missed my attendings. I missed the academic mindset. Community medicine was tricky for me at the time, and I missed the mutual respect that I had from intergenerational practice. The colleagues had set up a new office for me. You see me pictured there at Hahnemann, and in March of 2019, as I sat in that office and took pictures of the clear blue sky on my first day back, it felt like a professional homecoming. I had no idea what was about to happen when I left at the end of June for a 4-day vacation. My family went to Vermont. You see my kids here drinking their morning tea. My husband is a tea lover. Their elementary-aged bodies were playing chess in those large chessboards that you see at resorts where the pieces were just about as tall as their heads, and my husband and I were taking time to just simply relax as my children ran around. All 4 of us had kayaked that morning across Lake Champlain and back, giggling as my husband and my son sang "Row, row, row our boats." On our 3rd day in Vermont, my cell phone blew up with text messages first thing in the morning. Our local paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, had broken the news that Hahnemann was closing in a few weeks' time, and St. Christopher's was to remain open, but it was about to become embroiled in a bankruptcy proceedings. There were no formal emails or announcements internally from any authoritative leader at all. Not even my boss had any idea what to tell us or what to do. The texts kept coming from friends, colleagues, and family. We all had questions, and no one had any answers. To tell Hahnemann's story is the example that I'd like to use today to frame how to write about medicine, about the things that we do, the obstacles we face, and how we cope with it all. There are multiple places that this story could start. I chose to start with my own because I am here before you. Multiple vantages from which people can feel how I felt in the final weeks when I returned from vacation, while also depicting an American healthcare system that allowed a busy but beleaguered hospital to close, and to reflect that Hahnemann is both entirely unique and entirely ordinary in its eventual downfall. I'm going to tell you many stories from many vantages, and all of them are also one story, which is the story of Hahnemann. The idea that any story has multiple possible tellings and retellings is true for anything you may choose to write about, including within the provision of healthcare or outside it in your personal lives. One of the things that I want to caution all of us as physicians is that storytelling is not the same as telling a medical history. Medical school teaches physicians to listen to patients with an ear attuned for clinically meaningful details that lend themselves towards diagnostics. Classic hallmark details make for discrete answers to the puzzle of what is wrong with a patient. Swollen feet and a headache in pregnancy, preeclampsia. Chest pain radiating down the right arm or left arm, I don't even remember anymore because my patients don't have heart attacks. Classically, myocardial infarction. Almost anything ever can be syphilis, so you have to remember that, but it can also be, as we took at dinner last night, HIV, AIDS, or in modern times, long COVID. You need to keep your ear attuned to what the patients are saying. And often when doctors start writing reflectively to tell stories on a page, they start by writing patient stories because those are the stories they're attuned to, and those are the things that we witness all day long. But turning inwards is where the magic happens, both for personal processing and catharsis when writing, and also to begin to tell an interesting story. First-person narration is what draws a reader into the world of a narrator. So to talk about writing and why I write about medicine, I'm sharing today the story of Hahnemann as just one example of how a story can weave and shift and have different types of impact when told in different ways. When you first zero in on what you'd like to write about, you need to answer some basic questions, and I challenge you at first to answer them just free-form and flowing and not think about the fact that you are writing, but think instead about answering the questions that you see here. Who, how, why, what, maybe when. And then you have to think about why you are writing about the thing that you're thinking about. When I returned back to Hahnemann after my vacation, I had no framework for going back to work in a hospital whose patients were there and needed to be cared for by those of us who still remained, but where societal structures in which the hospital served the community meant there was absolutely no commitment to keep caring for them. I had absolutely no control. I was a bystander to something that was going on that was beyond my technical medical training, and none of us there in Hahnemann had a framework for how late-stage capitalism can obstruct medical care literally within a day. Writing gives writers an illusion of control, and as you write, and as I began writing many things, it helps you cope with things that you cannot control, because you can control what happens in the world on the page. You can organize your mind into a cogent story, and all of the chaotic things, all of which are true that are going on in the world, become streamlined so that your mind can coalesce around them and you can make sense from essentially nonsense. As you keep going, if you choose to write, you need to think about who your audience is. You need to consider if you're writing for yourself, because the process of writing, reflecting, and narrating or making sense of something is healing for you, or are you writing for a reader? What began for me as a personal writing journey eventually became a professional one because I discovered I had something to say that I wanted other people to hear. And so I've kept going, writing for a reader. I needed to figure out, both as I prepared this to you today to talk about Hahnemann and when I write any particular piece, who the reader is. Who are you talking to? Are you talking to other doctors? In which case, the details that you pick and the way you frame things are going to be encoded in a medical language in which we are often very comfortable. If you're writing for patients, the way that you are going to present yourself as a healer will evolve. It's difficult, I will say, to present yourself as a vulnerable physician, possibly not always knowing when you are writing for patients that you care for who may or may not read or reflect on the fact that you at some point may have had a doubt. If you're writing for politicians because you want to impact policy, or you're writing for intellectuals with an academic interest in the topic of, for example, late-stage capitalism impacting healthcare, then you're going to include different types of details that are going to be meaningful for the people who are going to read your piece. And then if you're speaking to students, you may want to strike a more optimistic tone as opposed to a pragmatic tone so that you don't discourage their eventual growth, knowing, of course, that the world that lays before them in their careers, your careers if the students are on Zoom, is going to change over time. So as you gather knowledge and you consider who you're writing for, you want to think about what you want the reader to experience. If you simply want them to learn something, which is a common academic goal, then you're going to provide an information dump. In the case of Hahnemann, you could list money lost and revenue gained. You could list the demographics of patients served, as I showed you earlier in this presentation. You could talk about the dates the medical school opened or closed, when it was embroiled in bankruptcy the first and then the second time, what happened to the building years later, which right now, as we speak, remains mostly still shuttered. If you're looking to create a more intimate experience for the reader, which allows the reader to find themselves in your story and make an emotional plea for the injustice of the things that you are seeing, then you need to tell a story with vivid detail that draws the reader into a relatable scene, makes them feel comfortable, and allows them to experience the example, in this case of Hahnemann, as I experienced. If I want to draw you into the old Hahnemann NICU, I will tell you about its fluorescent lighting and the scrub sink by the door, where our Jamaican unit clerk, Jamaican accented unit clerk, would yell at everyone who entered the NICU before the double doors even closed to wash their hands before they passed her by, lest they get a baby sick with their germs on their hands. About the tiny break room where the nurses used to microwave their lunches in the middle of their shift, and the wooden rocking chairs where parents sat holding their babies over decades while those infants learned to nipple from a bottle or breathe without a machine. I am telling you a story about a place you can see with details that are both specific to Hahnemann and also specific to almost any neonatal or pediatric ward on which you may have once worked. If I tell you that I once stood with Dr. Chawla at a baby's bedside and we watched the loops on the ventilator and twisted its dials and watched her chest rise and fall and rise again and twisted more dials and watched more loops until we were both satisfied that she was breathing comfortably and safely, despite the tube I just inserted between her ribs, you can see me standing in that NICU next to a man you just heard about, and you can see that the attendee or attending helped me, and we all helped our patients, and hopefully you might believe that we gave our patients in that NICU everything we had. If you have a different goal in mind, which is to spark new ideas, either policymaking or intellectual ones, then you're going to present a different type of information altogether. Critical thinking in a reader arises from obvious information presented in a non-obvious way. To tell the story of an impoverished hospital in which the reader can feel the value of the care provided might be a goal. To tell the story of a greedy man owning that hospital, determined to make a profit from sick, indigent patients, is of true detail. And to tell the story of the security guards who guard the former building daily for the 5+ years while it stood empty and every day turned away people coming to look for healthcare in the shuttered building is to belabor something that the community of Philadelphia lost. So what happened when I got back from vacation? The answer is I went back to work. I went back to Hahnemann to take care of patients whose numbers dwindled in those July weeks, but they did not abruptly stop. After a morning rounding in the well baby nursery and bringing around, I don't know if you have this here, like an iPad on a pole that accesses multiple languages. So that particular day I had Spanish, French from West Africa, Haitian Creole, Vietnamese, all with me in the well baby nursery. And then I went to a 4th of July festival with my boys, and I was chatting with a friend who's a physician elsewhere in the city, and I told her that I had just been rounding that morning, and she was shocked to hear that there were still patients at Hahnemann. She told me she'd never get care at Hahnemann given those circumstances. The tone in her voice conveyed to me what I felt from her was a judgment that if I were somehow smarter or a better physician, or those patients were smarter or more adept or more knowledgeable, that we would all be worthy of giving and receiving care in a more elite system like hers, and I wouldn't be grappling with the hardship that I had grappled with that morning. But most of the patients I had seen that day did not speak English, as I just explained. Many had walked to the hospital. They didn't own transportation. They didn't care much about the news. Maybe they didn't even know how to read it, because if they did not speak English and the news was not targeted to them, how would they even know what was going on, despite the countless news articles day by day in the Philadelphia Inquirer and the local news? Many of those patients simply had nowhere else to go. They were human beings, just like me, just like all of you, and they deserved quality health care all the time, despite the bankruptcy, despite the owner, despite the dysfunctional elevators and the embroiled bankruptcy going on. I'd chosen to return to Hahnemann, not because I couldn't work elsewhere, but because it was the best place for me at the time, and the label on the door of anything doesn't always predict what's inside the package. It's true when shopping, and it is true in healthcare. To help myself cope with the chaos at work, I went to the bookstore. Now, I found a book, and you may note its title here on the screen, Fleishman is in Trouble with Buildings Upside Down. And I found in its cover and the pages inside it a particular irony that has stuck with me over the years. I remain forever connected to this book. I've read it multiple times. It became a TV show, and I re-experienced the personal journey of living through it all over again as I watched it on television several years later. I also remain thankfully connected to its author, who wrote it when she had also just turned 40, as I had that very month, and was having her own suburban midlife career crisis of a different type. My familial life at the time was also exceedingly hard that summer. I wrote about my family because it was easier. I could encapsulate it, and I felt like I owned it. I felt like I had the authority to tell the story of my household because I lived there. One piece that I authored at the time began as follows. The everyday lately has been a bit uneven. Our house lost power. The dog injured her leg. She needs a surgery. My father-in-law dissected his aorta. And yet every day is still there. Oatmeal, tennis balls, elephant and piggy. I am fixated on presence, on the quiet moments between the doing, the dog pressed heavy with the sleep against my shin while I write, the coffee cold with too much milk, and the uneven echo of my older son dribbling a basketball in the driveway. And then, as I penned that essay, a tree fell on the roof of our porch, and my husband got shingles, and the sweltering July heat made everything seem impossibly hard. So we started cleaning out the house, throwing things away, because that felt cathartic at the time. I applied for new jobs despite having just returned to Hahnemann, because we didn't know for a number of weeks who among the Neonatology division would remain to staff St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, which to this day remains open and dedicated to serving the children of North Philadelphia, and who among us would be laid off due to Hahnemann's impending closure. The day after I got summoned to the C-suite at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children and told that my position had been cut because of Hahnemann's closure, my son came down with unbearable abdominal pain, and I ended up a night or two later taking him to the ER for what was ultimately deemed to be enterovirus. But at the time, I couldn't see through his moaning and unremittent agony to understand he had a benign problem. My diagnostic skills as a physician failed my own son. I'd never once before or after taken my own child to the ER, save for a broken bone. I felt listless, and I wrote about that too, and the medical journal heard my voice as his mother and diminished my voice as a physician in the piece, despite its prominent placement, felt to me like a patriarchal slap in the face when the image on Facebook accompanying the piece was a small toddler in a plastic potty. I could not become a doctor to my son at that time, nor could I be his mother, nor was I succeeding as an authoritative voice as a physician if I was writing solely about potty training and constipation. I felt exhausted and completely unmoored. But my story, this is Hahnemann and its final days with murals set up by the staff, was not the only story. At the time Hahnemann closed, it employed 574 residents, 800 nurses, and roughly 2,570 total employees. Every one of them has their own story about its closure, about how they found out, where they were, how they coped, and what they saw in those last few weeks, and what happened to their careers once the doors closed. Within days of the closure announcement the last week of June, the ACGME began focusing on relocating the resident trainees. Many of them had just moved to Philadelphia only in the days prior. Speculation ensued, but was, I don't think, ever corroborated that the closure announcement was timed with some type of monetary transfer from CMS for salary support for this new crop of residents starting at the end of June. Otherwise, why would anybody allow people to move from elsewhere in the country knowing that the hospital was not going to exist much longer? Legal fights ensued over the Medicare funds for those residency training spots, both in the short term and on a permanent basis. As more prestigious hospitals in the city appropriately accommodated the training needs of Hahnemann's orphan residents, Reddit filled with snarky comments that those residents hadn't studied enough in medical school, which is why they were at Hahnemann in the first place, and they were thus undeserving of training at the same fancy hospitals who adopted them with smarter and better graded students. Never mind that everyone had the same medical degree. Never mind that none of those residents had created Hahnemann's catastrophe. They went to work side by side with those Reddit-empowered colleagues, and they became board-certified doctors in the end, all the same. Nurses, many of whom only had associate's degree and had spent decades at Hahnemann, assuming they'd retire from their work there forever, grappled with a new job market that hadn't existed in the 80s when they finished school, a job market that did not respect that they had decades of experience but outdated degrees. Some of those nurses would never work again. Everyone inside Hahnemann grappled with losing what the hospital meant to each of us. We each faced a lack of answers from leadership, a dwindling lack of supplies as bills went unpaid, and a lack of a clear path forward. We were all angry. When the hospital became guarded floor by floor to prevent employees from stealing anything that could be later sold in a fire sale to pay bankruptcy creditors, I felt demoralized. I'd been coming to work to take care of human beings, but all anybody cared about was the value of the things in my bag when I went home at the end of the day, as the lives that I was saving were not encapsulated on a spreadsheet for the bankruptcy court. What happened to the hospital? Unions fought to prevent its closure. Now, Hahnemann is located about where these people are standing, and this building in the background, which you see here, and again beside Bernie Sanders here, is Philadelphia's City Hall. It's just a few short blocks away. And over those ruckus weeks of the summer of 2019, many rallies were held. People would march down Broad Street from a hospital to the City Hall and back again, screaming and ranting and raving about the closing abruptly of Hahnemann. Bernie Sanders was then running for president, and he stood in front of Hahnemann and stated, to be very blunt, that the hospital was closing due to corporate greed. He cited private equity's separation of the value of the hospital and its patient care from the value on the land in which it stood. Indeed, that was how the private equity owner had structured his purchase of the facilities. Disinvestment in human lives and an inability to profit from government-funded health insurance as the primary payer for both almost all of Hahnemann's mostly indigent patients had contributed to the hospital's financial peril. Sanders sought and continues to seek protection in the form of regulation for urban hospitals, lest others be shuttered and turned into downtown condos in cities around the nation, which face similar financial struggles based on their payer mix. Journalists, and this is one article from The New Yorker, documented the rapid and chaotic downfall of the hospital, despite Pennsylvania laws and statutes to prevent exactly this. Laws can state that you need to tell the Department of Health within 90 days and organize an orderly wind down of a facility. But when leadership has no interest in doing so and won't pay people to, for example, sterilize instrument trays, the state has no teeth to enforce those laws. Absurdities like parking ambulances out back into which patients were corralled at night and driven to other city hospitals were reported to the press by senior leadership, as were the rantings and grandiose swings of the hospital's final owner. The New England Journal also appropriately noted that the most disheartening aspect of all of it, for myself and many staff members, was the complete disregard for the abandoned patients. What is going to happen to them? A hospitalist asked. No one seems to care. Indeed, what happens to the patients at Hahnemann and the millions of others whose nearest hospital closes around the nation is a matter of considerable debate. Hospital closures, like Hahnemann, are not infrequent. About 800 US hospitals have closed since 1990. This quote I'm reading to you was published in 2019 when Hahnemann closed, and the closure rate is increasing and continues to increase. The hospital served patients whose stories are difficult to capture, but they are out there if anyone ever chose to find them. To talk about Hahnemann is to juxtapose the rich executives in fancy pinstripe suits standing in my NICU and telling us that they simply had no money to pay staff, while wincing at the smell of an unhoused mother who had just arrived to visit her sick children receiving care in that NICU. To talk about Hahnemann closing is to remember the tent city across the street, the peeling paint inside the facility, which was not maintained well in its final years, the abrupt inability to obtain supplies or medicines, and also the jovial way that everyone held the elevator door because no one knew when another working one would come. And to pay homage to the chipper Vietnamese women who ran the gift shop in the lobby that sold what I still maintain was the strongest iced coffee in all of Philadelphia. To talk about Hahnemann closing is to remember the emails in those final weeks that the parking lots were no longer available to employees and wonder if they had perhaps been sold. The rambling meeting where the owner stood at the podium in St. Christopher's Auditorium in the spring and mumbled that Hahnemann would close the weeks before it happened, but then made no written or formal announcement. So the rambles felt fleeting and fancifully far-fetched because wouldn't someone running a business to care for human beings phase out that life-saving care in stages, carefully, with a plan that met the city and state requirements? To talk about Hahnemann closing is also to remember that the doctors and nurses I knew there were incredible clinicians. Dr. Chawla, who when he got tired would turn his turban around to become someone else so that he could keep caring for his patients. And he understood why he went to work every day. He understood what he was as a physician and what he had to offer. He was there the day the very last baby left his NICU for the very last time. He closed Hahnemann's neonatal services with dignity. We gave those patients all we had, and the result was exceptional clinical outcomes despite unexceptional facilities. Once, years before the bankruptcy/closure turmoil ensued, I had sent a security guard via taxi in the middle of the night to get something very specific from St. Christopher's that I needed for a baby that I couldn't find in that mostly adult hospital. It's not uncommon for those of us neonatologists who work in community delivery settings but are accustomed to the niche supplies of a children's hospital to suddenly find ourselves without the things that we need. The security guard went off without complaint. He jogged off the elevator in the middle of the night, washed his hands in that scrub sink, lest our clerk get mad at him, and he handed me the thing that I needed for my patient, who went home several months later. We could have worked lots of places, but we chose to work at Hahnemann then because of who we were with, what we did. We believed in what we were doing. A few months after Hahnemann closed, the pandemic ensued. The nation spoke about flattening the curve and having not enough hospital beds for that very first surge, and the city tried to reopen Hahnemann. It would make sense, after all, if there was a closed hospital full of medical supplies, that we might use its wards to care for patients with COVID. The owner, however, still embroiled in bankruptcy, tried to extract a profit from the city, and the city rightly told him, politely, to shove it. They opened a field hospital at Temple University's Leah Corus Center, an actual basketball stadium, to save lives there instead because lives were valued in the stadium. COVID pandemic turned Hahnemann into the city healthcare workers' favorite protest backdrop. You can see here protesters calling both for the hospital to be reopened and protesting for Black Lives Matter movements during the pandemic. But for many years, I remained stuck. As people kept going to protest at Hahnemann, I didn't know where to begin telling the story of Hahnemann. I let it sit inside me and recede into the past as I moved forward with my own life. But the protests kept going. In 2024, many years after Hahnemann had closed, residents from nearly all of Philadelphia's training hospitals rallied outside of Hahnemann to vie for unionization across all training facilities in Philadelphia. One of those residents worked with me at Einstein. She told me the work she was doing with the union, and I learned she'd been at this protest. She did not know when I spoke to her everything that had happened at Hahnemann, although she did know people who had been impacted by its closure. I told her a bit about my experiences there, and the more she learned, the more she felt that it was indeed the perfect place from which to advocate for systemic improvements in American healthcare. In talking to her, I began to figure out how to tell my own story. So many years after I'd buried what happened, I began to excavate the story of Hahnemann and everything it meant to me. And today, after your invitation, I decided to use this as an opportunity to begin telling it. There's one more question you need to answer when you're writing for an audience, a question you may be asking as you've listened to me talk about my events from 7 years ago now. Why am I telling you this story now? We are living in a changing world. The power structures and global hierarchies and systems are changing. You can deny it or disguise it, or you can try to drive the change. You can not embrace it if you wish. Shaping what the world is going to look like is not an easy calling, and for most of us, including myself, we cannot impact the macro level changes going on in the world. But on a micro level, the level on which we stand before another human being who is sick or suffering, who has come to us for help as healthcare workers, seeking only survival, we can impact the future. Changing lives, saving lives that someone else does not value is indeed a radical thing. I'm talking about Hahnemann's closure because more hospital closures are coming. I hope that by looking backwards, by remembering and retelling and revisiting, those listening to me might remember and protect the vulnerable who entrust us to care for them, to tell the story of one hospital as a beacon of hope for a community that needs it desperately, by remembering the countless lives we saved there, whose stories are reflected in its walls, is a much longer story than I can tell today, a harder one to tell, but when it ends and the hospital shutters, as it always was going to in this retrospective revisiting of Hahnemann, I hope those of you who are listening to me tell this story, feel its loss so deeply that you might long to have your own care at a place where you simply can't get it anymore. So as you've listened to me today and you think about telling your own medical story, the first step, and I don't know if you've thought this as you've been listening to me today, is decide what you want to write about. Think about something that has happened to you, either within medicine or outside it, something in your personal or professional journey. Consider how the different strands of your own identity as a human, a doctor, a wife, a mother, an owner of a lovely dog have shaped this event for you. And write down the who, what, when, and how. Consider why now, why are you telling this now? And then reflect. Consider how you felt, what you saw, what you learned. Think about who you are talking to. Remain humble enough to realize your story is one of many, and your truths are both completely specific and universally true, all at the same time. Thank you. I thought I'd leave time for questions and discussion.
I'm so sorry that this was not better attended. This was meant to be a graduation gift for seniors. Hopefully that they would learn what you just told us, and I'm just totally amazed by what you guys went through. We all of us have kind of fallen similar paths. My time in neonatal and Brian's, and we had a different experience in Joplin. We lost our 300-bed hospital overnight in a matter of seconds. And right across the street was our competitor, who did absolutely nothing to help us, left us floundering on our own, going through tents and temporary buildings and living out in parking lots and cooking at fires, not literally cooking at fires outside. But it brought the community together in a way that you can't even imagine. But the sudden abrupt loss was probably easier for us than the slow attrition of what you went through. And I'm every day I wake up, my wife and I are just amazed at the cruelty and the ignorance being shown by this administration toward human beings, how they're being treated, how they're being sent to the side. I work in rural healthcare, and the people that voted so strongly for this administration are the ones that are going to be most hurt by the devastation of rural healthcare by budget cuts. I hope, hopefully things will turn around. I'm an optimist by nature, but what I wish the students would have been able to hear is learning how to tell your story, because there's so many stories in this. Funny stories, sad stories.
I have a question or comment. I don't know how you want to take it, but a colleague, actually our bioethics fellow across the street at Children's, posed a question to me of how is it that doctors are so privileged that they get to tell their stories and have them published in academic journals and clinical journals, but patients don't?
What's called Facebook, right? We have a honest to God litany of every single visit we have in the emergency room is reviewed by the general population at large in our small town. And so there's a whole lot of feedback that we're just not privy to.
I think as physicians, we are trained to find value in the audience amongst our peers in medical journals. Some of us find great value in that, some of us little. And to have an audience of people who read medical journals as a physician is a natural outgrowth of our academic growth. For patients to talk to physicians may not be the world that they want to speak to, meaning the world is full of different ways, as you say, to express oneself, and not all patients find value in the space of a medical journal to be read by, let's be real, a few hundred physicians, mostly, of those articles. And so for a patient to share a patient experience, they might find more bang for their buck in terms of readership, or even literary goals in more literary or newsy or social media type of space. It depends who they're talking to.
You know, the personal reflection, there's one section, JAMA, every week, that is a personal reflection of a physician. And they are invariably just hitting it out of the park. That's the thing I look forward to most every week, was reading what some other physician said about his life and what experiences they've had.
A Piece of My Mind is the name of that
Yeah,
column.
yeah.
Other questions or thoughts?
Tell us a little bit about your narrative medicine activities.
Sure.
at Jefferson.
When I, after this all ended and I was busy writing mostly personal essays, as I was talking about before, and I took what is my now current job I've had for almost 7 years at Einstein. My chairman at the time, chair of pediatrics, was a staunch and sage, also very attending, named Maddie Irgoyan. And Maddie had, before she became the chair of pediatrics, had run the academic general peds fellowship at Columbia in New York. And Columbia has a large narrative medicine program. Narrative medicine is a specific type of health humanities teaching tool or teaching structure. And it has infiltrated the hospital there. And I was fortunate to have Maddie, who sort of saw in my writing value as in terms of my voice as a physician, but who also encouraged me to have some academic presence in terms of teaching and academic pursuits that were adjacent to the writing. And so I sought individual mentorship, not a proper certificate or degree, in using the humanities to teach. And then I began teaching the people who were available to me, which has mostly been residents and faculty in what is largely a community hospital where I work now.
What does that entail?
It entails both, I send out a monthly essay, almost when I started this many years ago with this man who was the CMO. The thought initially was, well, let's have a book club for doctors. And I said, oh, no, doctors are not going to read a book a month. So once a month I send out an essay or a poem or a short story by email to the full medical staff. For a while I was curating discussions of those pieces, and we had these lovely cross-departmental discussions of things that were going on. They're medically adjacent, but not always specifically about medicine. Many in later years have become stories of illness told either by physicians or patients. I think there's both a lot of value in people reading about how an author chooses to present their own illness on the page, and also sometimes writing and reading when it is too far afield from medicine and is presented in a medical space can seem not relevant to the immediate work that we do. So I have sort of tailored the types of readings that I send out. And then I work and do teach more classic back and forth close reading of literary texts to resident trainees in several departments across the hospital. I tend to teach the same piece. I'll go 1 month I'll have whatever piece planned. I go several times a year to each department, and I have a multi-year longitudinal curriculum. And so, I'll teach whatever the piece is in multiple departments, and by the end, I cannot believe the things that the obstetricians are telling me compared to the things that the surgeons or the emergency medicine docs see in just the same particular essay. So.
Well, I was blown away this morning at our breakfast group at Mission Hills. the speaker was a fellow named Ted Higgins, who's a vascular surgeon who's been staffing the Fleishman Medical Clinic down in Haiti since way before the earthquake. And I was down there for a month after the earthquake, and it changed our lives. But he was telling us about all the work that people from Kansas City have done to help support this clinic. And it just, when you started talking about your experiences with Haiti and
Well, not mine, my colleagues, but yes.
Right. Just people that go above and beyond their practice and spend time helping other people. And like you say, people aren't at Hahnemann or Kansas City General Hospital because they're not up to snuff. They choose that life. And you choose to take a cut in pay and a change in lifestyle to do that kind of work.
Absolutely.
I had to moonlight as a emergency room physician to be able to afford to be a professor here.
Rachel? Oh, please.
Great presentation. I'm curious, when you're teaching residents, I mean, you talk about audience and all the different things you can do with writing. What are your goals for the residents to walk away with?
I do not teach the residents to write.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I teach them to read. I used to incorporate reflective moments, reflective writing in response to the pieces that I select for them. But I have learned over time that in the middle of a clinical day or in the middle of conferences, residents are not medical students. They are busy providing healthcare. And they are carrying the emotional weight of both their own experiences and fatigue as trainees, along with the weight of all the things that they are seeing and being taught. And asking them to open themselves up with reflective writing is a very challenging task. And I have learned that if they do engage and open themselves up, and then I stand up at the end of the hour and leave, I leave them open with nobody to close that reflective wound, if you will, or process for them as humans. And if they don't engage, it's in a way self-protective. And so as I have become more attuned to the needs of my trainee audience, if you will, I have, and sometimes people will come to me with, pieces and I will help edit, but that's more of an individual or one-on-one mentorship, which is different. And then the answer to your question is, with conversation. But it is very challenging to teach writing to working graduate medical trainees in the middle of their workday.
Were you a journaler before you got into medicine?
I was a creative writing minor, or had a, what we called at Columbia University special concentration in creative writing. I went to college, my mom said, you were going to be a journalist when you went to medical school, but when you went to college, what is all of this stuff? And the short answer is my father is a mechanical engineer, and I remember him sitting me down before I went to college, and he's saying, Rachel, you consider yourself a feminist. You're very good at science. Don't just stop and go do this other thing that you want to do it. You need to pursue your sciences so you can pay your bills and take care of yourself. You don't want to be relying on anybody else to do that for you. And so I just kept going with my science classes. And this other, I met my husband in a creative writing seminar, although he was math major. And the sort of natural outgrowth of that, for various reasons, became that I became a physician. But the longer I worked as a trainee, the less I wrote until really all of this stuff started to happen, and it kind of cracked me open. So.
Dean, do you have any thoughts?
What you're doing is essential work, and we have a huge focus on medical humanity.
Yes.
It matters to us so deeply and so fundamentally. And in our case, I think it's a particular focus because many of our students are young.
Mm-hmm.
And that has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. Its advantages, primarily among that, is that they are unformed, unbiased. There's very little deconstruction that's necessary with them. The disadvantage is they don't have the wealth of experiences that others do, or even only 4 or 5 years older than they are. And so I just want to thank you for sharing your story, your narrative, this opportunity with us, because this really does matter to us deeply.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Rachel.